Thank you very much for Danya. Very, very good to be in Sheffield again. I love coming to Sheffield. I've been coming here for quite a few years now, and it's always a pleasure. And it's good to see the Sangha Night so full, and lots of new faces as well, people I haven't seen before. So that's really great. That's really heartening. So I became a member of the Padmavajra Buddhist Order back in 1976. Punk was just starting, and I was a punky order member. Anyway, and in 1978 I attended my first order convention. So that was a gathering of order members, which a big retreat for order members. And it seemed really big then. I think there were about 30 or 40 of us, so we thought that was a really big retreat. And it was led by Sangha Night, the founder of our order, our teacher. And he led everything. He led the meditations, he led the pujas, he gave talks. And meditating with him was quite an experience. I've never sat with somebody who was so still. And I don't just mean sitting still, I mean a very, very, very still consciousness, and really intent. And you'd finish a meditation and he wouldn't get up for about 15 minutes after the end of the meditation, so we'd all be sitting there sort of shuffling around, and it'd just be looking at the ground for a long time, really absorbing what had gone on. And he gave some very important talks on that convention, which had a very big impact on me. And that impact runs on. He gave a talk on going for refuge, where he talked about the centrality of going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, the act of commitment, levels of going for refuge. He gave a talk called A Vision of History, which I really would recommend you check out, because his vision of history is of a battle between the spiritual community, individuals gathering together inspired by a common spiritual ideal, and a battle between the spiritual community and the group, the forces of uniformity, of power, of repression. Very interesting, placing us in that context, and even talking about not just Buddhist spiritual communities, but he spent a lot of time talking about Manichaeism. And he gave a talk on the system of meditation. And that last talk was looking at our different meditation practices that were sort of around in our order that he taught us. And he showed us how they formed a system, a path. So the mindfulness of breathing was a practice particularly concerned to bring about integration, to gather our disparate selves, if you like, our energies together, so that there's unity in our being. If you haven't got that, very, very hard to make any serious progress in the Dharma. Then he talked about the metta bhavana as developing very, very intense positive emotion. Very difficult to make progress if your emotions aren't flowing positively, creatively, particularly the emotions of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, faith, devotion. He talked about a practice called the contemplation of the elements, which was to bring about spiritual death. You might have got yourself together very, very positively. You think that would be great if you can gather yourself and be in a very positive state. But that has to die. That has to kind of fade away to open up to something even greater, which is spiritual rebirth, which comes about through meditating on the Buddha in a particular form, the form that is most meaningful, most fascinating for you, visualization practice. And it was very, very helpful as a young lad, a young order member, to put all this material together into a system. And in recent years, this system is being explored more in our Sangha, in our community, and you've been doing that here over the last few weeks. Well, I think since September, apparently. And towards the end of his lecture on this system of meditation, Sangha Night asked the question, of where did another important meditation practice fit in? A practice known as just sitting, capital J, capital S, just sitting, which is a completely structureless practice. And it was something that Sangha had really encouraged us to practice. You can't practice it. And I want to read you what he said because it's of very great importance and very simply and eloquently put. So he says, what about the just sitting practice? It is difficult to say much more about this than when one just sits, one just sits. But at least one can say that there are times when one just sits and times also when one does not just sit. A time when one does not just sit is when one is practicing other meditations. One does not just sit when one is practicing the mindfulness of breathing, the Padmavajra, and so on. In all those other meditations, conscious effort is required. But one must be careful that this conscious effort does not become too willed, even too willful. And in order to counteract this tendency, we can practice just sitting. In other words, we practice just sitting in between the other methods. There is a period of activity during which you are practicing, say, the mindfulness of breathing or the Padmavajra, and then a period, as it were, of receptivity. In this way we go on. Activity, receptivity, activity, receptivity, and so on. Mindfulness of breathing, just sitting. Padmavajra, just sitting. Recollection of the elements, just sitting. Visualization practice, just sitting. We can go on in this way all the time, having a perfect rhythm and balance in our meditation practice. There is a taking hold of and letting go. There is grasping and opening up. There is action and non-action. Thus, we achieve a perfectly balanced practice of meditation, and the whole system of meditation becomes complete. I think it's very simply, beautifully put this, actually, making it clear that Dharma practice, especially meditation practice, does involve conscious effort. We really do have to get hold of our chaotic, habitual mind, the mind which the Buddha and the great teachers say is like a rutting elephant, an elephant in must. It's very powerful, the mind. We totally underestimate its power, and it can cause, therefore, a lot of damage. So we've really got to get hold of our mind. We need to train it and direct it and consciously work on transforming it. All that energy, all that rutting elephant of the mind needs to be transformed into creative direction. And a lot of effort is involved in this. You know, for example, the mindfulness of breathing, let's just take that. Well, the world we live in just encourages distraction, fragmentation, dissertation. You know, I mean, especially these days, I mean, it's just nuts. You know, I go and, you know, check out my email. Oh, just check the football results. Or have a look at the news. Oh, what's going on there? You know what I mean? You're off. Well, that is not conducive to the mindfulness of breathing. Fortunately, I don't have Facebook and all that nonsense. But through the mindfulness of breathing, sorry if I through the mindfulness of breathing, you're gathering all this, you're concentrating all this, you're bringing this mind together so you have a deep and rich focus. You're able to focus on your real purpose. It's the same with the Padmavajra. Again, we live in a world that actively encourages negative emotion. The news is endless disaster. You know, there's just this constant provocation of anxiety. There's just this constant culture of complaint, this feeding of lack, this setting up of division and opposition. You know, and people, I think, suffer a lot of emotional exhaustion, you know, on top of all the other sort of dramas that go on in people's lives. There's all the sort of stuff that plays out through the media. I think people are completely done in emotionally. Well, in the Padmavajra, you really have to work to push that back. In that practice, you're really working to develop a very positive, creative attitude to others, to life itself, a very friendly, loving, optimistic kind of energy. So you have to really work in meditation. But having worked like this in those meditations, you then need to relax, to not try, to let go, to allow the fruits of your efforts to just come through, to listen for them, as it were, to notice them. When we make effort in meditation or in any other area of our life where we're developing skillful karma, skillful action, when we do that, we set in motion very, very positive forces. Often we underestimate the positive forces that we're actually unleashing. And we need then to allow them to reverberate through us, to affect us, to let them take you where they will. If you just keep piling on the effort, you just get sort of spiritual indigestion or spiritual exhaustion. So at the end of the mindfulness of breathing, at the end of the Metta Bhavana, if you've done puja, at the end of puja, spend time just sitting. You're not making any effort, there's no practice, you're simply opening up, learning to receive, learning to be spiritually receptive. You're practicing spiritual receptivity without trying to practice spiritual receptivity. Now, this topic of spiritual receptivity has a much wider reference than meditation practice. It's an extraordinarily rich topic indeed, and it covers many areas. I'm certainly not going to cover them all in this talk. But for the rest of the talk, I want to explore at least some of these areas, so that we might all hopefully practice, or I hope it helps you to practice spiritual receptivity more fully and thoroughly. And I want to begin by reading from a work by the great Japanese Zen master Dogen. Dogen said, one day Dogen instructed, "Many people in this world say, 'I hear the words of the teacher, but they do not agree with what I think. This view is mistaken. I do not know what is in their minds. Can they be thinking that the principles of the sacred teachings are wrong because they do not agree with what they themselves imagine? This is sheer idiocy. Or are the words spoken by the teacher unsuited to their own minds? If so, why do they ask the teacher in the first place? Or do they say this on the basis of their own ordinary emotional concepts? If so, this emotional concept is nothing but the deluded mind that has come down from the beginningless beginning to the present. The key to studying the way is to discard all conceptions of the self you have held up to now, and to regenerate yourself completely by following the sacred writings, even if they do not happen to agree with your beliefs. This has always been the one essential to the study of the way. A few years ago, when I was studying, among my fellow students was one who clung firmly to his own beliefs. He visited many Zen masters, but he wasted his life and failed to understand Buddhism because he rejected what did not suit his mind and accepted only what agreed with his own preconceptions. This made me realise that the study of the way must never be approached with this attitude. With this in mind, I followed the words of the teacher and awakened fully to the truth. Later I found the following passage in one of the sutras. I read, "If you want to study Buddhism, do not bring with you the conditioned mind of the past, present and future. I knew for certain that I must forget the various views and opinions accumulated from the past, and that I must gradually reform myself." A secular work says, "Loyal words are harsh to the ears." This means that valuable advice often offends one's ears. Even if disagreeable, such advice, if firmly followed, will ultimately be of value. Quite Strong stuff, isn't it? And I think you can appreciate from this what an uncompromising teacher Dogen was. And he's making it very clear indeed that if we are serious about Buddhist practice, we need to take in and take on the Buddha's teachings as they are. That we don't pick and choose according to our denuded mind, or what Dogen calls our ordinary emotional concepts. What he means by our ordinary emotional concepts are our false views caused by our deep negative emotions. So in order to do this, in order to take on the Buddha's teaching as it is, we need to find a teacher and a spiritual community that have been able to identify the essential principles and practices of the Dharma that we can actually use here and now. And I say this because, frankly, a lot of Buddhism that has come down to us is not actually relevant, and it's a distraction from the way and from the path. So we need to find a teacher, we need to find teachers, and then we need to listen, to really listen. Traditionally, you listen to the teacher, you listened to the teaching, you really hear it, you take it right in as it is, and this is the very beginning of the path, the very beginning of wisdom. According to the Buddha and Buddhist tradition, there are three kinds, three levels of wisdom. First of all, there's the wisdom that comes through hearing. Secondly, there's the wisdom that comes through directed thinking. And thirdly, there is the wisdom of living experience. But the first is hearing. Wisdom begins with hearing. Wisdom begins with listening. And in the time of the Buddha, of course, it was like that, literally, but the Buddha and early Buddhism operated in an entirely oral culture. There was nothing written down. The teaching was always delivered orally. It wasn't in books. The Buddha couldn't read or write, nor could his disciples. So the teaching was heard and taken in and remembered and handed on very preciously. And in the Buddha's day, a wise man, a learned man, was known as Bahu Shuddha, one who has heard much. Nowadays we find the wisdom that comes through hearing retranslated as the wisdom that comes through learning, because it comes through reading Buddhist texts. But I think we need to preserve the literal meaning of Shrutamayi Prajna, the wisdom that arises through listening, through hearing, even if that knowledge comes through reading. I think we need to preserve the original meaning because listening, hearing, suggests to me strongly receptivity. Recall those moments, perhaps, when you've been walking on your own, say, in a wood, and you hear suddenly a strange sound, a bird call, perhaps. Suddenly you stop. You listen attentively. You're alert. You're open. You're curious. What was that strange, haunting sound? Or think perhaps to those times when maybe you heard a Dharma talk or you were reading a Dharma text and suddenly the words had a richness and a resonance, a truth that seemed to somehow go straight to the heart. And suddenly you are still. You're fully present, attentive, alert, you're listening. You don't want to miss anything because this is the truth. Sometimes though, as Dogen says, we don't like what the teaching is saying. It goes against our long-held, unconscious, deeply held views about ourselves and our world. Sometimes people really don't like it when they discover that the Buddha did not believe in a creator God. And in fact, he regarded such a belief as a product of deeply held insecurities. People don't like that. Or people don't like the fact that the Buddha did not say, for example, that all religions are one and lead to the same goal. That can freak some people out, but that is indeed what the Buddha taught. And people will try to create their own version of the Dharma. There's plenty of examples of this, the way in which people come up with their own versions of Buddhism. But it can also be much more subtle than this. In one way or another, we try to keep the stark, searing reality of the Buddha's actual words from really penetrating our consciousness. For example, verse 5 of the Dhammapada. Not by hatreds are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is an eternal law. Usually we would accept this, but there might be times when we feel wronged by someone, hurt by someone, and when we feel justified in our hatred and filled with righteous indignation, and when somebody quotes that verse very irritatingly, we find ways of saying, well, no, this is different. So where is there the receptivity to the Buddha and his teaching there? So we need to notice the ways that there's a disparity between the words of the Buddha and our actual state and what we want to conveniently believe in. So we need to spend a lot more time making sure that we really listen to the Dharma, that we understand it as the Dharma before going off on our own interpretations, our own trips, and freely rejecting what we don't like. This doesn't mean, by the way, that we have to passively accept whatever we hear and whatever the Buddha says and simply parrot it out like a Buddhist catechism. That wouldn't be receptive. If we did that, that wouldn't be receptivity. If there are teachings we don't understand, if there are teachings indeed that we don't like, we need to engage with them, even wrestle with them, and find out what they really mean. It might even be that you find some teachings just boring. We don't have they just make us feel sleepy and dull. I remember many years ago, I'd been ordained a while, and I realised that I really didn't have a handle on the most essential Buddhist teaching of all, Pratitya Samutpada, conditioned co-production. The truth that everything is a flow of dependently arising conditions. I didn't have a handle on what are known as the 12 cyclic nidanas of the Wheel of Life, which you're going to be looking at. I didn't really have a handle on the Four Noble Truths, all that talk about suffering. No thanks. This absolutely fundamental stuff, whenever I knew it, I could even probably give a talk on it. But somehow I kind of doze off in relation to it. It was boring. I wanted Tantra, Shunyata, great bliss, ecstasy. That was where it was at. But one day I heard Sangha say that, listen, if you don't know conditioned co-production, if you don't know the 12 links, if you don't know the 5 skandhas, if you don't know the 4 truths, you don't really know anything about Buddhism at all. So I thought, well, okay, that's what my teacher says, better take that seriously, better get down to it. And fortunately, because I was running study groups, it's really good when you do that. I started a group to really look at this material, to really go into it, not just as a set of ideas, but really trying to get at the principles and really trying to find their applications in our actual experience. And we really got into this group to make all this material live for one another. And I discovered an extraordinarily rich and profound world of Dharma, of liberating Dharma. I would recommend, if there's any teaching you don't like, you either think it's boring or you have aversion to it, get together with some people and start a group to investigate it. There's probably a very good reason why you don't want to look at it. And if you get into it, so much will open up, so much energy will be released. So we need to really hear and listen and learn and take in and be receptive to the Buddha's teaching. Get especially interested if the teaching offends you. That's good, it's working. If you really don't like it, well, it's touching you. That's information. Don't be like Dogen's fellow student from his early days who ends up rejecting the way. And his doubting, critical mind just destroyed his Dharma life. It's like no teacher is good enough. No teaching is good enough. That's a very lonely, arid place. Traditionally, when we hear the teaching, learn the teaching, we need, it's said, to avoid the defects of a bowl. The defects are, first of all, being like a bowl that is upside down. You know, obviously nothing's going to go into the bowl if it's upside down. So you might come to the Dharma class in a really bad mood. You're really grumpy. You've had a hard day at work, you're tired, and you're really closed off. So whatever is said just flows off you, and you wonder why it's been such a rubbish evening at the end, why you've wasted your time. So don't be like that. Or don't be like a bowl that has poison in it. Okay, the Dharma goes into a bowl with poison in it. But because of, if the Dharma pours into a mind which has some negative emotion in it, you misinterpret what it says. You use a perfectly good Dharma teaching for your own self-serving ends. It could simply be that you like arguing with people. You always want to be right and have the last word. And you use what you've heard, what you've learned, to beat people over the head. So don't be like a bowl that's got poison in it. Or you are like a bowl that has a crack in it. The liquid is poured in, but it leaks slowly away. This means that we just cannot retain any Dharma we have heard, we have learned. Our mind is just not concentrated enough. It's not integrated enough. We're too distracted and disparate. We maybe need to simplify our life in order to really receive the Dharma. So when we go to hear the Dharma, or go to a study group, or read a Buddhist text, we need to make sure that we're the right way up, that we're open, that we want to take in what is being communicated. We need to get ourselves into the right state, open and eager. And we need to make sure that we're in a positive state, a state of metta, of faith, of devotion. And we need to develop some concentration. We need to still the mind. Then the Buddha's teachings can actually go in, and they can go right into the depths of the mind. Sometimes, in the right circumstances, that the Dharma that is heard is enough to bring about direct seeing of things as they really are, and the radical transformation that follows. Stream entry, becoming irreversible from enlightenment, enlightenment itself. There's the very famous story of Bahia, of the bark cloth. I mean, he didn't mean he went around looking like a tree. The bark was probably some sort of fibrous clothing. And he was a kind of holy man who lived in Western India on the seashore, who travelled across India, thousands of miles, and found the Buddha. And he urgently wanted to hear the Buddha's teaching. He was eager, inspired. He was completely open. And he wanted the truth. He had a sort of even an inkling that, life was very short. He didn't have long to live. And he asked the Buddha for the teaching. And the Buddha was reluctant at first because he was in the middle of his begging round. And the Buddha always did one thing at a time. So he didn't teach when he was begging food. But because Bahia was so up for it, as we might say, the Buddha just looked right at him and just said, in the seen, only the seen. In the heard, only the heard. In the imagined, only the imagined. In the sensed, only the sensed. That's how you should train, Bahia. When you train like that, there will be no thereby. When there is no thereby, there will be no therein. When there is no therein, there will be no here or beyond or in between. Just this is the end of all suffering. So just hearing that right there and then was enough for Bahia. He was liberated. He was enlightened. Did anybody get it, by the way? No, sorry, I'm not the Buddha, am I? So it's not going to work. You try. So that's a little bit on the wisdom that comes through hearing, that comes through listening, through fully receiving the Dharma. The Buddha, of course, isn't around for us. We can read about him in the texts. We can imagine the Buddha. We can gain a great deal from that. But if we're to take the practice of spiritual receptivity further, we will need to be around spiritual friends. People who are practicing, people who are committed to the Dharma, who make the Dharma live, because they're really living it. So what about our attitude to them? I want to begin exploring this through looking at a very significant period in the life of our teacher, Sangha. So as you probably know, Sangha spent many years in India, and in 1950, I think, he was ordained as a Buddhist monk. And shortly afterwards, he went to study with an Indian Buddhist monk, a very famous scholar named Jagdish Kashyap Ji. He was a Pali scholar, and Sangha studied Pali Abhidharma, which is an aspect of Buddhist philosophy, and logic with Jagdish Kashyap. And they were living very closely together. Kashyap Ji was giving Sangha personal tuition. And at that time in his inner Dharma life, Sangha was very concerned with the problem of the ego. That view that we have of a fixed, separate, unchanging self. And at that time, Sangha saw that as the problem. That fundamental self-centeredness, self-grasping was the problem. And one day he reflected, well, there's a problem here. I want to transcend the ego, but I'm trying to do it with the ego. Isn't that self-defeating? And light was shed on this problem in a book by a Cistercian monk named Thomas Merton, who spoke positively of the Christian monastic practice of obedience to your abbot, to your spiritual superior. And Thomas Merton spoke positively about that, about surrendering your own will, giving up all ego assertion, and just obeying the commands, I suppose, of the spirit of your spiritual superior. So Sangha decided to practice this himself with Jagdish Kashyap. He thought, okay, I'll just surrender to Kashyap Ji's will and do whatever he wants. But there was a bit of a problem, because Jagdish Kashyap was a really easygoing monk. And he'd always ask Sangha what he'd like to do. So he'd ask Sangha for his advice. So there's Sangha trying to surrender, and his teacher, in a sense, won't let him. But Sangha practice did bear fruit ultimately, because Jagdish Kashyap took Sangha to Kalimpong, a town in the eastern Himalayas, to see Jagdish Kashyap's disciples. And at the end of their stay, Jagdish Kashyap just turned to Sangha before getting into his jeep and driving off, and said, stay here and work for the good of Buddhism. And then he just left town. So this had a tremendous effect. Sangha was completely alone in this town. He had no friends. He had to start from scratch. He had to beg his food at first. But in time, he over the years, he got together his own monastery. He met his Tibetan teachers, and so much else came from it. And it all came out of obeying his teacher. It all emerged from his practice of surrendering to his teacher, of being totally receptive to his teacher. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all surrender your will to, say, Vedanya, or that you should all obey Surya Mati. Although that might be an interesting exercise. It might be an interesting exercise, but I'm not suggesting that. But if we're to make real spiritual progress, we do need to develop intensive spiritual friendships. And friendship does involve a kind of surrendering. Any kind of friendship, actually, if it's worthy of the name. It does involve a kind of surrendering and opening up to others, and definitely the cultivation of receptivity to our friends, in this case our spiritual friends. You can't have friendship without that. I mean, if we're always just asserting our way of doing things, you never have any friends. It's as simple as that. Just on an ordinary human level, leaving aside spiritual friends. There's a very, very beautiful sutta in the Pali Canon called the Chulla Gosinga Sutta. And in this sutta, the Buddha visits 3 monks, 3 wanderers, 3 renunciates, living together in the forest, living in retreat. And when he arrives, after being welcomed by them and made comfortable, the Buddha is very soon asking them whether they live in harmony with one another, whether they live like milk and water blended, whether they're that close. And the 3 of them reply that yes, they do live in that harmony, like milk and water blended. And the Buddha wants to know how. How have you achieved that? Very interesting. The teacher's asking the disciple how they've done it. And they reply that first, they reflect how good it is to dwell with such friends, such spiritual friends, such companions. It's just good to have friends, companions, living this life of spiritual striving. And they go on to say that they practice continuous metta, friendliness for one another, in body, speech and mind, and that they, all 3, just decided to surrender their will to one another. All 3 of them independently decided to live according to the wishes of the other. Which means, of course, that all 3 of them never have to ask each other for help. They live in a vivid awareness of one another. There's a kind of vital receptivity to one another. And at the end of this passage, they end this passage by saying, we may have 3 bodies, Bhagavan, Lord, but we only have one mind, one heart, ekachitta, one mind, one heart, 3 bodies, one mind. Wow. And they go on to describe their meditation practices, their weekly, all-night-long study group. Imagine doing a study group all night long with other people, and you've just got one mind. Wow. I mean, what is that going to be like? And they also talk about how they've mastered the whole range of higher meditative states, even unto enlightenment itself. This is really an incredible, beautiful, kind of ordinary, extraordinary Buddhist text. And it can be an inspiration to us in our own spiritual friendships. Spiritual friendship, or any friendship, is not about getting something. It's not about using others as a kind of sounding board. Real friendship, real spiritual friendship, is about surrendering to our friends, so that we're receptive to his or her purpose, to his or her spiritual purpose. And we do all that we can to support their spiritual purpose. There's a very beautiful essay, early essay by Sangha Night called The Good Friend. He talks about what it means to serve a good friend, to be a good friend, to live a life surrendering to a good friend, to good friends. He even says this is the emotional equivalent of the teaching of not self. This is the emotional equivalent of shunyata, of emptiness. If you've really opened up to the truth of insubstantiality, you will befriend, you will serve. And befriending and service, you can turn it the other way, is therefore the preparation for wisdom itself, for seeing things as they really are. It's also deeply satisfying service. I was asked recently in a study group, very direct question. I was asked, when are you most contented? When am I most contented? You know, and of course, very often you can think that contentment is about, you're sitting in an armchair, you've listened to a fantastic bit of music, or, you're out in the garden and it's all groovy with the birds and everything. And I thought, well, actually, I've been most contented when I'm serving. I find that deeply satisfying. I remember when I was a young lad, I'd only been ordained a few years, and I lived in India when I helped Lokamitra to start things in India. And Sangha Night came out to do a very intensive lecture tour And up until that point, I have to admit, I really fancied myself as a Dharma commando, that I was, really hot at breaking through to enlightenment and all that kind of thing. India soon sorted that out, as it does. But what my job was with Sangha Night there was to be his sort of attendant. So I washed his robe, typed his letters, made his tea, put his mosquito net up, swept his room, gathered up the garlands after these incredible lectures he gave, took him through the crowds and everything. And I was really happy. I was incredibly happy. I just forgot myself. For 2 weeks, I just put myself at the service of my teacher. And I still feel that way, that the opportunity to do something really very simple, to serve another, is one of the most satisfying things I can think of. So let's make selflessness real now by really opening up to our friends, by being receptive to our friends. Yes, indeed, even by serving our friends. So I think it should be clear from what I've said so far that the practice of spiritual receptivity is not about being passive and laid back and indifferent and cool and spacing out and all that kind of thing. Being all sort of drifty and so on. Spiritual receptivity means being profoundly alive and attuned to what is actually happening outside of you and responding appropriately, effectively. Practicing spiritual receptivity involves, in fact, an intensification of our Dharma life. And when your Dharma life intensifies, stuff happens. Stuff sometimes that is really hard to take, hard to bear. I mean, beautiful things happen, but rubbish things happen, or they seem to be rubbish. When we get seriously into Dharma life, we naturally think that things can only get better. It's a horrible song, isn't it, that somebody used. There will just be this smooth, easy, happy growth, just really groovy. But I can assure you, it's rarely like that. I mean, if that happens, great. You've got a lot more going for you than I have. But in my experience, it's rarely like that. There are times when our Dharma life. Sorry if you're new to the Dharma, and I probably shouldn't be saying this. Sorry about that. But there are times when our Dharma life results in a breaking up of all certainties, even the certainties we had about being a Buddhist. Even our ideas of being a Buddhist and of what Buddhism is, or even our ideas of ourselves as a human being. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Life could be dealing it out to us. The loss of a loved one, poor health, loss of any kind, even Buddhist friends changing, leaving us, turning even against us. There are times when it all just seems to be crumbling away. And it's here at these times the practice of receptivity, of surrender, is really important. We have to really let go into the very nature of things, accepting that we are not and never can be, in the end, in control. We are not the Lord and Master. The great poem by Sangha Night called Life is King. Hour after hour, day after day, we try to grasp the ungraspable, pinpoint the unpredictable. Flowers wither when touched, ice suddenly cracks beneath our feet. Vainly, we try to track bird flight through the sky, trace dumb fish through deep water, try to anticipate the earned smile, the soft reward, even try to grasp our own lives. But life slips through our fingers like snow. Life cannot belong to us. We belong to life. Life is king. And this is the realm in which the Bodhisattva lives. A Bodhisattva is someone who is fully engaged in life. He's fully engaged with others. He loves he or she loves others. A bodhisattva is someone who gives themselves totally to others, with no holding back. A bodhisattva is someone who makes things happen for others, who builds and creates for others, so that all can live the life of the Dharma. At the same time, the bodhisattva knows that life is king. So the bodhisattva lives courses in what's known as the perfection of wisdom, the empty and insubstantial nature of everything. The bodhisattva plays in that. The bodhisattva does what needs to be done. In one place, Sangha says, doing what needs to be done is the ultimate end of the path. It sounds simple, it sounds even disappointing, it sounds kind of flat. But if you think about it, doing what needs to be done, that is extraordinary. To do what needs to be done means that you have removed all selfishness, all subjectivity, all self-serving tendencies from your consciousness. There's just this loving consciousness right out there, completely tuned up to the needs, to the aspirations, to the wishes, to the potentialities, to the richness of others before you. And then you act decisively, effectively, for the benefit of others, to bring all that forth. In the end, spiritual receptivity is the love, the great love, and the spontaneous activity of the bodhisattva. And you get a kind of little insight into what this might be like in a more sort of detailed, almost down-to-earth way in Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, in his section on guarding mindfulness, guarding awareness. There's a little description of the bodhisattva's awareness, what they're like. Regard the body as a ship on account of the way it comes and goes. At your own command, set the body on course to fulfill the needs of beings. One's own nature mastered in this way, one should always have a smiling face. One should give up frowning and grimacing. Be the first to speak, a friend to the universe. One should not throw down stools and other furniture violently with a crash. One should not pound on doors. One should always delight in silence. The crane, the cat, or the thief achieves his intended goal by moving quietly and gently. The spiritual aspirant should move in such a way at all times. One should respectfully receive the advice of those who are able to direct others, who offer unsolicited aid. One should be the pupil of everyone all the time. One should express one's appreciation of all that is well said. When one sees someone doing good, one should encourage them with praises. One should speak of others' qualities in their absence and repeat them with pleasure. And when one's own praise is spoken, one should reflect on that person's recognition of virtue. One should speak confident, measured words, clear in meaning, delighting the mind, pleasing to the ear, soft and slow, and stemming from love. One should always look at people directly, as if drinking them in with the eye, thinking, depending on them alone, I will attain Buddhahood. One should be able and energetic, at all times acting on one's own initiative. In all actions, one should not leave any work to another. One should do nothing other than what is either directly or indirectly of benefit to living beings. And for the benefit of living beings alone, one should dedicate everything to enlightenment.